So here we are, brimming with ideas, inspired by new ones. Each of us, I'm sure, making resolutions, determined to try something new or perhaps approach life a little differently. I feel it's a little bit like New Year's Eve when we do something quite similar. We jump out of bed on the first day of the year, ready to start that novel or give up junk food or maybe even run 5 kilometers a day. But then before we know it, it's the 17th of January, which is apparently how long the average New Year's resolution lasts before we lose momentum, run out of steam, or just simply give up. And as the old saying goes, the road to hell is paved with good intentions. And it's amazing just how many get lost along the way. And before you think that I'm going to stand here and preach to you about how every good idea that I've ever had has transformed into something positive, well, here's a few that certainly didn't. At 14, I had a very promising career ahead as a footballer. I was very fortunate to have the opportunity, the talent, and the platform. I'd been signed by a professional academy from a very young age, and having resolved to do all I could to make it and push close to that dream, I let myself down. I ate the wrong food, I stayed up late, I even drank alcohol. I hung out with the wrong crowd, and I succumbed to temptation along the way. And on my 15th birthday, when I should have been out on the training pitch, ready to step closer to the dream, I was actually waking up in a jail cell in my hometown of Blackpool. I pledged to never go back to one of those places in my life ever again, and I'm pleased to say that I haven't been. But for sure, I have lapsed many times since then. I think perhaps most appallingly was the way that I behaved for the first 6 to 12 months of my teenage daughter's life. I just left the army at the time. I was working in maritime security, protecting international shipping, usually abroad in faraway lands. And each time I took on another job, I promised to my partner at the time that I'd spend more time with the family. And each time that I returned home, normally after months of absence, I felt that I let them down again and again. And that's not good. That's not something that I'm proud of at all. In fact, quite the opposite. You see, I love the idea of being at home, but it just never transformed into action. And as a result, it created a spiral of disappointment and disaffection. And in the end, it completely broke the relationship. It also sent me into a dark hole of severe anxiety and depression, something which I still take medication for today, if the truth be told. Okay, I don't want this to become a public therapy session of some sort, and I'm sure that you don't either, but hopefully you get the point. We've all promised to go to a friend's party or guaranteed a work colleague that we'd call them back later, or maybe assured a loved one that we'd pop in and see them. And for whatever reason, we haven't got round to doing it. You see, it's very easy to have a lovely idea and to make a show of good intentions without actually ever following them through. Especially in today's world of mobile technology and social media, where we can very easily stand somebody up with a miserable-looking emoji or drop a quick message in the group chat that work's got in the way again. So what is it? What is it that makes us commit? What is it that pushes those resolutions past the 17th of January? And what is it that turns a simple idea into real positive, authentic action? Well, that's something that I've been battling with for a very long time now. In fact, last year, I battled with this idea for 149 days, 7 hours, and 32 minutes to be quite precise. Normally, before sunrise, and usually up to a quarter of a mile out at sea, trying my best not to be pushed backwards by the wind as I made my way around Great Britain on a paddleboard in the middle of a global pandemic. Yes, as you can imagine, one thing that I am pretty good at is social distancing. But the thought was sparked by asking myself, what the hell am I doing here? It was mid-December. I was off the west coast of Scotland. It was the early hours of the morning. I was sore, I was cold, I was injured, and I was physically and mentally exhausted. But most importantly, I was becoming increasingly concerned that I was going to fail on my promise. A promise to a little boy called Ibrahim. A promise to build a school on the Horn of Africa. But you see, the promise to Ibrahim was built on a promise that I'd made to myself many, many years earlier. I was serving in the army as a soldier at the time. I was on my second tour of duty. I was in southern Iraq. I was 20 years old. And it was a day like many that I'd experienced before. I was taking my team out on a routine patrol. And as we made our way to the city centre, in the distance I could see a group of children that appeared to be playing to the side of the road. And as I got closer and closer, as our vehicles made progress, something wasn't quite right. You get that sort of sixth sense in a conflict environment as a soldier. And as we approached, I thought maybe this is an ambush. Something just isn't right. But then, as we arrived at the scene, it was neither. They weren't playing and it wasn't an ambush. The children were actually in great distress. One of the children had inadvertently stepped on and activated an IED, an improvised explosive device, a roadside bomb for a more general term. I held that child in my arms, and it was too late. There was nothing that I could do. And I've replayed that scene over and over in my mind for many years. And as I was driving back to camp that night, I said to my interpreter, I said, what were these kids doing next to that busy road? Why were they not at school? And he looked at me in complete disbelief, bordering on disdain. They will never go to school, he said bluntly. There is no school. I felt stupid. I felt embarrassed. I felt ashamed. And lying in bed that night with 1,000 thoughts bouncing around my head, I realized how lucky I was. How my council estate upbringing that I'd used as an excuse many times was not a hardship in any way at all. And as I lay in my sleeping bag that night, I made a promise. I promised myself that one day I would do something to help children less fortunate than me access education. There and then in that very moment, I couldn't crystallize what it was going to be or when it was going to happen, but I just knew that it was a promise that I would keep. And it may have taken a while, but I never forgot. I spent over a decade in the army before moving into security and then the world of adventure. I've dangled off mountains, I've slept in the snow, I've jumped out of perfectly serviceable aircrafts. I've also been attacked by pirates. But on the flip side, it's allowed me to travel to some of the most extraordinary places. It's allowed me to meet the most incredible people on this planet. It's also allowed me to embrace some of the most diverse parts of our world, including the Horn of Africa, where I first met little Ibrahim. A young Somali boy who had been displaced by the conflict in his own country and had found himself as a refugee in Djibouti. Ibrahim, he wasn't like kids that I speak to back home these days. They often tell me their dreams are wanting to be an influencer, a YouTuber, a vlogger, a blogger, an Instagram model, a social media star. But not Ibrahim. He had a big dream, but it was very simple: to one day go to school. And when he told me that in that very moment, two things happened. Firstly, I realized that this was my chance. This was my opportunity to complete the circle and make good that promise from that traumatic night in Iraq 15 years earlier. Secondly, I looked Ibrahim in the eyes, we shared a fist bump, and I made a promise that I was going to build that school and he would attend it one day. Actually, as you can imagine, there was a third reaction as well, which was a few hours later when I got back to my hotel room. I looked in the mirror and I said, "What the bloody hell have you signed up for here?" But I was determined to succeed. I was determined to proceed, which meant meeting the National Minister of Education, and it meant meeting the President of the country. Two men who both gave me the very skeptical looks of people who'd heard similar promises from the West in the past before. And then, of course, I had a monstrous amount of funds that I needed to raise. Not to mention the logistical maze that I'd have to embark on to distribute and spend those funds, which is what eventually led to my paddleboard story. Suffice to say, after 5.5 months at sea, learning more about resilience than I probably did in my whole military career, I never actually made it all the way around Great Britain. I stopped paddling. Not because I was exhausted or because I was tired or injured or cold, but because of Scottish COVID regulations, which is quite ironic for someone who just spent half a year at sea on their own on a paddleboard. And initially, I struggled to see the funny side. With 23 kilometers to go to a new world record after already paddling for 2,500, it was difficult to accept. But I was quickly able to put it into context, because this was never about me. This was about keeping a promise. And despite the anticlimax, the funds came pouring in. And of course, there were twists and turns and still many challenges to overcome. I struggled to understand the rules and regulations of import licenses, trade agreements, the labor challenges in country. There was corruption, there was COVID-19. But the long and short of it is that little Ibrahim now has a school to attend. Thank you. And I've never felt better about keeping my word, which brings us back to the original question: why? Why have I kept some promises and broken others? Why do some of our ideas flourish when others falter? Well, my take on this mishmash of promises kept and broken is in how we define the word promise. Because there are times when we are prone to using the word promise, when what we actually mean is wish. A wish is something that we'd like to happen. A wish, we might desperately want it to happen, but we aren't prepared to take responsibility or accountability for a wish. We wish we'd go to the gym more. We wish we'd work harder. We wish we'd spend more time with a loved one. There's nothing wrong with a wish, of course, unless we confuse it with a promise. Because when we use the P word, we are making a commitment. We're becoming accountable to ourselves and to the recipient. Promising to enroll on that education course, promising to take your partner out to dinner, promising to write that new book, or promising to build a school. We have to take full responsibility for our promises. We have to sculpt them in oak to ensure they are kept. Because we haven't just made them to cause a smile, but to engender complete and utter belief in their fulfillment. I've challenged myself. My next promise is to help students in the UK learn more about the STEM subjects using my adventures from around the world. I'm going to start by including young people in all my future expeditions in some capacity. And please feel free to hold me to that. But how about you? I challenge all of you to take this formula and resolve to turn an idea into action by making a promise and keeping it, regardless of what life throws at you on the way. It's changed my world. Over to you. Thank you.